Under what circumstances to cite medical marijuana dispensaries. And I believe Mr. Cotto, are you going to lead us off, or is Mr. Weiler? Mr. Cotto.
I will be leading off with a short staff presentation. Good afternoon, Chair Falcone and members of the Ordinance Committee. We're here to have a discussion, the first discussion of the permanent medical marijuana dispensary ordinance. Purpose is to review and discuss a proposed ordinance, and the ordinance that is attached is really for discussion purposes only, and I believe it's modeled after a number of other cities in California, and then provide direction to staff and the Planning Commission for further review. Just a bit of history. August 14th of this year, the Council directed staff to prepare an interim ordinance that basically prohibited any new dispensaries until the permanent ordinance could be drafted. And October 3rd, Council did adopt that ordinance, and it went into effect on November 3rd. The proposal that is in front of you in the staff report is, like I said, sort of a compilation of a lot of different other jurisdictions, but it basically boils down to locational requirements, operational requirements, and permitting of some sort. So what's in front of you is a proposed 3-year permit with multiple 3-year extensions allowed. It would be approved by the staff hearing officer, and there would be a number of locational and operational requirements. And again, this is all for discussion. The proposed locational limitations: the C2, CM, and M1 zones, greater than 500 feet from schools, more than 500 feet from parks, and more than 500 feet from other medical marijuana dispensaries, and not on State Street between Cabrera and Arriaga. And there are different options for how we want to treat these for residential. If we follow the adult entertainment ordinance that we have on the books right now, that says not allowed within 500 feet of a residential zone, and leaves it at that. There is another proposal, and in fact the CAR says that, and then the ordinance says something else. The ordinance says not allowed on properties that have residential units unless there's some separation, or the staff hearing officer can find that it's, okay. And then not adjoining residential zones. So there's actually a whole bunch of other different ones, but those are the two that we've been talking about. And I have 2 maps.
I hope the camera can get that, because it's clear as mud.
Well, it's because
I know it's the best you can do, Mr. Cotto.
It's the whole city could boil down into a little thing. What this tries to show is the areas where they would be allowed. Anything that's in red in this would be areas where medical marijuana facilities would be allowed, and that's a good part of downtown, excluding State Street. And you can see that there are parks and buffers around parks. A good part of the industrial area, and a little bit of the outer State Street, kind of between about maybe Hitchcock and the city limits. This is if we went with an option that said only not allowed on residential properties or adjacent to residential zones. If we look at this next one, so notice the amount of red on this one, because when we switch, it's going to be slightly less, because this says not within 500 feet of residential zones. So that cuts out a big swath, where the last one kind of just went one property that's adjoining. Again, but still, it's a smaller area in outer State Street. It's less of the downtown, but about the same amount of the industrial area.
Mr. Cotto, Mr. House has a question for you, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Because that's an important distinction. The adjoining, I understand, as that it would be right next to residential neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But within that same phrase, it said, but they're separated by another commercial. Is it another commercial enterprise or something? So there'd be like a buffer between the residential neighborhood and the or zone rather, and establishment? Is that the idea?
Sort of. I think the idea is if you have a property that has a residential unit on it, it would basically not be allowed.
Okay, got that.
But if you had a mixed-use property, or if you had a house with a commercial, with a business in front, something like that, or housing on top of businesses,
Oh, I see.
that could be found to be okay.
In that one of
Because-
that option, in that particular, the other one
Yeah.
would be 500 feet, just,
Well, I mean, it all depends on what the direction that the ordinance committee wants to go.
Okay,
Like I say,
that's
these
the
are all
choice.
options, but one choice is 500 feet from residential zones, or X number of feet. It doesn't have to be 500. Another is not on residential zone, not on properties that have residential. I mean, it could be both. You know, there's nothing to say that.
Okay.
There's really nothing limiting the ordinance committee
you.
at this point.
Mr. Barnwell has a follow-up, I
But
think.
under the pyramid zoning of the city, aren't all zones, with the exception of M1, aren't they all residential zones?
Well, they all allow residential uses, yes, but they don't not all parcels have residential uses on them. So
Well,
if you,
so then the question is, what's the underlying reason for this entire discussion? Is it to keep them away from residential uses? And if so, then residential uses are allowed throughout the town.
that's correct.
So 500 feet from a residentially zoned might indeed be right next door to a residential use.
That is correct, and that's
Okay.
why there
I
are these
just-
different
all right,
options, yes.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions?
Please continue, thank you.
Okay, and we can come back to those maps anytime you want. Because of the PowerPoint limitation, we can't really zoom in on them or anything, but we can definitely talk about them some more. Now, as far as operational limitations, they are somewhat problematic, I guess, because they can be difficult to enforce. You know, there are some limitations that can be based on how the building is set up and, you know, floor plans and things like that, which are fairly easy to monitor when we do building permit plan checks. But other things like the numbers of employees or the types of employees, or even something like operating hours could be difficult to enforce, even though we would want to do that. So then the options, you know, as far as operational goes, is none, which I don't think we want to go to, but that is an option. Limited, and we could be limited to hours of operation, or no smoking within 200 feet or something like that. And then there could be, you know, a whole laundry list. And in the ordinance that's attached to your CAR, it does have quite a number of them. And they are shown summarized in this bullet list. I think there's about 18 of them. You can't have a criminal history, you can't sell to minors, you have to have certain operating hours, you have to have a certain size and limited access, various dispensing operations and consumption restrictions. You know, all these types of things are limitations that other jurisdictions have imposed on these dispensaries. So again, it's how much do we want to limit these? How do we enforce them? I think it's the staff's idea that the way, you know, I said there would be a 3-year validity period with renewals, and probably a good way to enforce on these is that if we get a lot of complaints and we find that people aren't, or these businesses are not operating in conformance with these limitations, then we would not renew their permit. It wouldn't be like a normal land use permit where it runs with the land, and once it's issued, you know, you're good to go forever. No, this would be limited for 3-year periods. So that's an idea.
Mr. House.
so it'd be like a conditional use permit, one that would be, that would have a limited time associated with it.
Chair Falcone, Councilmember House, yes, that's true, except that the CUP, the conditional use permit, actually, we don't limit it by number of years anymore. And that's something that we did way, way back and was found to be, I don't know, illegal or unconstitutional or something. So now, if you get a CUP, it just runs with the land, but this would be something special and limited.
I see. We did do that, I think, with the farmer's market and, you know, for reasons of getting the management thing worked out and all that. So I know we've had some experience with it, but that's the concept. I get the idea.
It's more like a license, if you will, than a strict CUP that runs with the land.
Yes, that's true. That would be true. Okay, so then permitting process, again, this is all options, right? If we went similar to our adult entertainment ordinance that's on the books, there is no permitting process. There's a list of limitations in the ordinance, locational, operational. If you meet those, you're in. and if you don't, then you're out. Of course, that if you have no permitting process, then you don't have a renewal, and you don't have that that enforcement mechanism. But that is an option. It's something that we do for our adult entertainment. What's proposed in the ordinance is the staff hearing officer. It's sort of like a mini CUP. I think we call it a special use permit for the dispensary ordinance, or dispensary permit, and it would be really a mini CUP, a mini conditional use permit. The other option would be a full-on conditional use permit from the Planning Commission. I think we as staff think that's probably a bit too much process for something like this, especially because there's going to be, well, at least the way we're sort of envisioning it, there are going to be quite a few regulations in the ordinance, and why have all that process when, I just don't think you need that much. That's our opinion so far, anyway. So our recommendation to you as staff is to discuss these, and please provide us with some direction, so when we go to the Planning Commission, we'll have something to go on. And the next steps will be a Planning Commission public hearing, an ordinance committee. We'll come back to the ordinance committee, and then we will go on to council for introduction and adoption. And that concludes my presentation. I believe Mr. Wiley and I are here to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wiley. But just for clarity, you are asking us today not to make the absolute final decisions about what this ordinance will contain, merely to discuss these concepts, for instance, the residential, whether or not to allow residential on some level or not at all is a concept, but it will go to Planning Commission, and then it will come back to us.
Yes, that's
Good.
correct. So we're hoping for some broad concepts like don't do this, maybe look at this, that sort of thing, and then we'll do that and come back to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Wiley.
Madam Chair, I actually wanted to ask Mr. Kato, and maybe we can't tell this from the map, but he knows, how the locational requirements in the ordinance impact the Milpas corridor.
Let's go back. Oops, wrong button. Sorry.
And then we have several people who'd like to speak. Anybody who would like to speak while Mr. Cotto's going back to the map, please fill out one of the white slips in the back of the room and bring it up here. We'd like to hear from anyone who would like to give us their opinion or make a statement. If you have already filled out a white slip, I probably have it. If not, feel free to get one in the back of the room. Mr. Cotto.
Okay, thank you. Now, the way that this is the first map that we saw that didn't limit you to 500 feet from residential zones. It was just adjoining. As the way it was written, the Milpas corridor is very narrow. It's C2 zone, but it's really only about one parcel wide on each side of the street. And if you said 500 feet from either side, or even adjoining on either side, you'd wipe out the whole thing for Milpas Street. So the way that this map, even though I can't really tell, it allows them on Milpas Street, and I don't think I can zoom in, but it does allow it. The next one, actually, because I probably didn't draw it right, the next one shows it that it's not allowed on Milpas because it was just kind of a blanket 500 feet from residential zones. But again, I think the idea behind the ordinance was to allow them on Milpas Street.
Well, and Madam Chair, the reason I ask about that is it's my understanding that we have some existing legal ones that, in other words, they were open and operating properly prior to August 14th of this year. And I'm not so much concerned with not impacting existing ones. I mean, I think that is a concern, and we should think about that. As much as having this ordinance be responsive to where the market, if you will, where the need appears to have arisen. In other words, these existing ones apparently are working out. In some cases, they're serving a neighborhood or whatever. And so I don't think we necessarily want to have an ordinance that just blanks half of them all out just because we think there's some locational requirement that makes sense. And part of this was, we've only got certain areas of the city that have C2 zoning that are really commercial corridors. State Street, clearly, perhaps not the downtown area, which is what we're suggesting. Milpas, you can ask questions about the commercial areas along the mesa as well. And I think, like, as Danny mentioned, this locational approach is, for example, been validated by the courts with respect to adult entertainment businesses. We're not necessarily making the comparison here, although there are some adverse elements that are shared. But the locational approach is that approach to say, well, we're going to figure out where in the city these things are appropriate and then have an ordinance and a permitting system that allows them there and doesn't allow them in other areas, such as the single-family zones or near single-family zones.
Mr. Cotto, anything to add? All right. Ms. Peterson, anything? A few more slips. Thank you. I don't set a time limit here, but if you could be succinct while telling us everything you'd like to tell us, we'd appreciate it. We do have a 2 o'clock council meeting, and some folks just have a few words to say and some have more. So I'm going to start here with Jennifer Nelson.
Thank you.
Pull the mic up to your mouth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Forgive me, I have kind of battling with a cold right now, so
I'm
my
sorry.
voice is a little not in sync. But I can appreciate the fact that they're modeling after these different ordinances from other cities, but we have to really keep in mind that Santa Barbara is a very unique city, and that we have to consider that this actually is going to be putting a lot of the dispensaries that are operating right now currently and serving thousands of patients. This will actually require them to close or find a new location, which is going to be quite difficult. So, first off, I would like to say that I am disappointed in this draft ordinance. Myself and others have offered their services multiple times, and we were never taken up on that opportunity.
Ms. Nelson, I don't mean to interrupt, but you represent an organization.
Americans for
Could you state
Safe
that?
Access, yes.
Sorry?
Americans for Safe Access.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just a couple of examples. No dispensaries can be more than 1,000 square feet. Let's see here. What about the rooms large enough for wheelchair access? We're talking about a lobby being 500 square feet and an actual dispensing room being 500 square feet. There's going to be multiple patients in wheelchairs, and that's going to actually, really affect. 1,000 square feet's not all that big if you really think about it. You have to have, of course, a lobby and a green room, you have to have a dispensing room for privacy of the patients. And then the criminal history. I admit that the owners and operators should be subject to an application process, but to deny employees and managers employment opportunity because of a misdemeanor involving moral turpitude or probation for a drug offense is absolutely absurd, in my opinion. A lot of employees are patients, and local law enforcement, even with proper paperwork, has been harassing, not to mention ticketing patients to this day on a weekly basis. I feel like, the owners and operators who have been running a clean and safe and crime-free dispensary for a couple years now deserve a little bit better of an ordinance than this. And, I really would appreciate it, if you please take the time to listen to the patients and providers and advocates. They truly are the key to helping the city adopt a proper ordinance. So,
Great. Thank you very much. Lyle Holmes is going to be followed by Alan Bifano. Mr. Holmes? Sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Lyle Holmes, and I read the ordinance on this, and I totally oppose about the price, which I saw about having it where we have to buy a month's worth at a time. And for me, I'm on SSDI, and I'm on a very fixed income. And for me, that would be very impossible to even comprehend that. From just the expenses I had to pay, I had to go to a cash advance place just so I could make my bills for the whole month. And so for me, that would be, it'd be outrageous. I could not do it. And with the recommendations I have from my doctor for my own illness, it's actually very much needed. And so that's basically it, is the price we're paying a month is, I think it's wrong, because a lot of us can't do it. So that's my word on that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Alan Bifano?
Good afternoon. I'm Alan Bifano. I'm an attorney that represents one of the existing dispensaries at this time. That my concern is that that this was for a moratorium, and I believe Mr. Wiley did indicate that the existing shops were not going to be using this regulatory scheme, or we are. I'm not exactly sure. It's not clearly stated in this ordinance, and that worries me because patients like Lyle are upset, and they're wondering what is this impact on them, because people are thinking about closing their shops. And as you know, the DEA has frustrated the situation by closing many of the dispensaries in town through either fear or just price of a stamp. And so right now, from just doing a count, we have 6 dispensaries that I count that are currently open, which may or may not be enough. I don't know, but I think it certainly deserves studying in those neighborhoods of what the existing shops we have and how. And I will say that this ordinance is very proactive. I think it's wonderful that you guys are many of the ideas that are here for regulation are already being employed by the existing owners, and I think certainly a field trip to one of these locations showing the council, or maybe I can facilitate that by providing a videotape of the security that is being in place. Actually, for just one incident is the situation with a camera for security. Many of these places, for economic reasons, are employing well over one camera, and that's just a small point. Now, there is a few pieces of this that I do believe is overbroad and may, in fact, eventually frustrate the intent of the legislature. And the ones that I, first of all, the one that Lyle brought up, he's a patient, as far as requiring people only to go in once a month. I think that it's clear from what he said that would frustrate the intent of the legislature in enacting first the Compassionate Use Act and then giving it teeth with Senate Bill 420. And the way it does that is by economically. I wouldn't use the word discrimination. I would say that it's economically frustrating the intent of the legislature by making it impossible for people to obtain the medicine they need for an entire month, and that's under F1. One other point that I think that you may want to think about is the fact that they're going to, under D2, the number of patients. Each time, I certainly agree that if they increase the size of the facility, no question that they should have to not reapply, but ask for permission from, I believe it's the staff hearing officer, and then with review to the planning commission. By saying that they have to do that each time they have a new patient, I think that creates an undue burden on the dispensaries. I would suggest, and I think that the one D2. I think
Isn't that an occupancy issue? It has to do with how many folks are allowed within a particular area, where I don't know that we are setting that, or maybe the Planning Commission. See, this all goes to the Planning Commission.
Sure.
But I think that's a fire department occupancy
And there would be absolutely no objection. I think that the concern with
So it wouldn't be patient by patient
with the owners
review.
would be that it's increasing by size by patients. That
It's a good area for clarification, though.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you. And I did have a concern with letter L, which I believe creates an undue burden and could impact privacy, which it regards the patient records. And I think one problem that we have in this area is that the Health and Safety Code requires the State Attorney General to implement a system for state ID cards, and they have not done so. This it speaks to the county health department, and my understanding is that that is not completed. And not only that, but it's not required to be a qualified patient to make a county, to be a county, have a county ID. So I think that making people go when it's not required under the code, and if you don't, then a city official can see the patient's information, including the doctor's information, and including the need for the medicine. I think that infringes on patients' rights and their ability to, or it could. I don't think it has to. I think that the one easy thing we can do is redact all that, and certainly not require going to the county, which isn't ready, and the state ID card system isn't being implemented at all. And I think as far as my main concern for my client is that we want to know how this affects the existing shops. And I think Mr. Wiley spoke to that, and I'm not really sure, and we'd like to brief that issue. And I appreciate your time, and that this isn't going to be finalized yet, and we're going to have some more time to speak on this.
No, I think this is the beginning of the process. And
Thank you very much.
We have further to go. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your points. You bring up a number of very good ones. Dr. Theran Wayhill, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and if not, please correct me.
My name is Dr. Theran Wayhill, and I'm the owner of Sacred Mountain Medicine. And I'm here basically just to say that I think us engaging as a community in this is a positive and courageous step forward. I can recognize this is the beginning of the steps. It's a very delicate issue for us to engage in for all kinds of reasons. I would hope to encourage this committee to continue to make our patients the forefront of the focus here and their needs, because we are here for compassionate caregiving to people who seek alternatives to pharmaceutical narcotics because they don't always work on their body or their problems. Some of the problems aren't visible physically, so we have to consider all of those things as well. I commend you. This was a courageous step forward, and as the gentleman previously just mentioned, most of those things in there all of us are already doing, so it's not that big of a shock. There are certain things that I kind of thought were strange, like closed on federal holidays, since I thought that was strange. But this is a step for us to take forward, and please just continue to consider the patients in this, because they're the reasons why we are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And the final person that I have a slip for is James Harder. If there's anybody else who would like to speak, please fill out your slip now. Mr. Harder.
Thank you very much. Most of the points that I wanted to go over today have already been covered by everyone else in front of me. I would just like to just go over them real quickly with you again. Definitely being closed on federal holidays is something I disagree with. You don't stop being sick because it's a holiday. People need to get their medicine at any moment. The size of the dispensary being 1,000 square feet is also, I agree, very small. Most places are already over that size, and to make them smaller would already be a great burden. Another point was the monthly medication purchasing. It says the policy is to discourage daily or weekly visits. I believe once-a-day visits by patients is fine. A lot of these people do not have, they're sick and they're lonely or whatever, and part of the medicine is the daily experience of coming in, talking with the staff, seeing what's new on the board. The medicine does rotate rather rapidly, and it makes a difference to be able to get in there every day and see what's available. Another point was again, the patient records. I think having to submit those to officials is not fair by the patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else who would like to speak? All right, then for this ordinance committee meeting, I will close the public comment. As I said, it is going from here with our suggestions and our comments and our questions to the Planning Commission. So that will be another hearing. I don't quite know when that's going to be set for, but it won't be, too long, I don't suspect. So, all right, well, it's back to the committee. Mr. Wiley, Mr. Cotto, and thank you, Chief Glass, for showing up. I appreciate you being in the room. Do you have any other comments? Mr. Wiley.
Well, Madam Chair, I just want to emphasize that this is just a draft to get the discussion going.
That's right.
And we often hear, well, staff didn't meet with us and try to work out a mutually acceptable draft. We tend to think that's not typically appropriate. It doesn't occur in a public meeting. We don't know who are the people that are officially representing anyone else, and anyone, it's just not a real practical or, I think, appropriate thing. We have to start somewhere. In my experience, it's best to start with a draft ordinance and just instead of having an open-ended theoretical discussion, which we've actually had in some ways already. So, but I really want to stress that this is just a draft, and these comments, to me, are very helpful in raising questions about, is this appropriate? All we did was look at, 6 to 8 different city and county ordinances and pull out what we thought might be an issue, might be appropriate in Santa Barbara. But because it's in this draft isn't necessarily a recommendation. And all of these things, as they say, came from other cities and counties, and they had their own reasons why they thought they were appropriate, but that doesn't mean we have to do exactly the same thing in Santa Barbara.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wiley, for that clarification. I think that's very helpful for everyone in the public to understand. And at the end of the day, this will be a community collaborative effort, because we will hear all the voices. We will take it all into consideration. And Ms. Nelson mentioned at the very beginning that Santa Barbara is unique, so we have to tailor this to our own needs. Bring it back to committee. Mr. Cotto, did you have anything? All righty. Mr. Barnwell, you lead us off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I want to just be sure that we say out loud that the thing that brought us here was not an argument over compassionate caregiving of people who felt they had medical reasons to use marijuana. There doesn't seem to be any dispute over that. In fact, when we had the meeting on the west side that I attended a couple of months ago, all of the neighbors, every single one of them, supported the idea of compassionate medical marijuana use. What they did not support was what had drifted into a kind of a recreational drug component of some of the dispensaries. That's why we're here, and how they failed to adequately be managed and interface with the adjoining neighbors. Keeping that in mind, I think we should craft this ordinance recognizing that. Insofar as that is concerned, let me just talk about a couple issues. I'm just going to go right through the ordinance. On our copy, page 7, at the top of it, it says these dispensaries shall be prohibited on parcels located within 500 feet of a school or a park. Again, I think we're talking more about an effect on children. There could indeed be schools with 25, 30, 40-year-old people in them, meeting at a certain time of the day or night that would probably even be after the closing hours of the dispensary. So I think we need to rework that. For me, it's more of a K through 12 or students under 18 kind of an issue than it is just simply a school. Yeah, Danny. Mr. Cotto.
Chair Falcone, Commissioner, Councilmember Barnwell, if you flip to page 5, the definition of school does exactly what you say.
Okay.
It's basically elementary, middle, junior high school, senior high school, or
I'm
any
sorry,
special
I missed
institution.
that.
Yeah,
I apologize. Okay, well, good. That we keep going in that direction then. Another one, The second paragraph there, prohibited on parcel having.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, sure. Go
Mr.
ahead.
Barnwell,
Go ahead.
on that point, I would like, and I'm not quite sure how many of these institutions that we have, but for those who are disabled, who have developmental disabilities, who may very well be not minors, but are susceptible to various forces that maybe others aren't. So I'd like that reflected in that particular piece. Thank you,
Right.
Mr. Barnwell.
Right. Paragraph 2 on that same section right there. Prohibited on parcels having a residential unit or on a parcel directly abutting a residentially zoned property, except a parcel zoned R2. I'm not quite sure why R2 was cut out separately, but then we go from zoning to use unless there are unless there are intervening non-residential uses. And it seems to me then what we would begin to have is the placement of a dispensary initially with no residential uses around it, and then the adjacent property owner wanting to put in a residential use and becoming an innocent who is affected, who can no longer have the full use of his property. You see what I'm saying? So I think we need to be careful about that as well, because so many properties in the city can be used for residential, and I think it would be unfair that the burden would be to the innocent adjacent property owner whose use would then be restricted simply because there was a dispensary next door.
We would never do that. You can't. If you've
Yeah.
got residential zoning, or you would build a residential unit, we would never say, "Oh, you can't do it because your neighbor's got a dispensary."
But this seems to suggest that.
No, we don't take zoning laws that way. You can build what you're allowed to build, and if it so happened, it might make that dispensary then non-conforming and couldn't be renewed. If
Okay,
that's
well,
the concern.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's the concern of the way that this is written. That might come up, and then the burden would be on the dispensary to have to move at the end of its 3-year term.
Right.
Or something.
We would never tell a property owner that they couldn't do something because their neighbor had
Okay.
done something.
Okay. I'm leaning toward the special permit concept, not the full planning commission discussion, nor do I lean toward the no permit at all, but the special permit staff hearing officer. I go again to the comments that were made by some members of the public. The operating hours weren't quite clear to me as to how we came to those conclusions, nor why it couldn't be just the same. 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year. Was there Okay. So I'm just suggesting that it seems to me that these hours are somewhat arbitrary and don't make a lot of sense. And insofar as policing the hours, I'm sure that the neighbors are going to be on top of that, like so many other ordinances that we have. If a dispensary isn't following it, I think the neighbors would be aware of it. I do believe that on page 8, D2, seems, although Ms. Falcone suggested it might be a fire marshal issue with the number of patients, I agree with her. I think it should be a fire marshal issue, but it isn't quite written that way. So I think that the concerns of the general public might be legitimate. Item number 3, the entrances will be locked all the time, it says. What do you do, knock on the door then and someone opens the door, or how does that work? And aren't there so many of these buildings that you got to be able to get out of them, at least from the inside out? So I have some question about that paragraph as well. It didn't make sense to me when I first read it, but it does, having listened to the comments from the public about the idea that if we discourage daily or weekly visits and are encouraging only monthly visits, then we're requiring people to have larger amounts of money to make monthly purchases, which are bigger dollar amounts, and that seems somewhat doesn't seem like where we want to go, again, because the thing that's getting us here is we are not disputing the necessity of medical marijuana as a caregiver issue, but only regulation insofar as the neighborhoods are being affected by recreational drug kind of inappropriate use. Most of the other things that are in here I tend to agree with. The patient records also, what is the policy legally with regard to a pharmacy, for example? Now, those are truly state regulated, county health regulated, but I mean, can anybody go in and get those records?
I don't know. We don't
Okay.
regulate pharmacies.
It
in
just
any
seems
way.
a little
Yeah.
invasive there. That one particular paragraph seems a little invasive, unless there's a need. But it seems to me you'd have to show the need before you'd have the ability to just go in and check records. So I'm looking forward to hearing what the Planning Commission has to say. Those are, Madam Chair, those are my initial thoughts on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Barnwell. Mr. House, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Deputy Chief, I wonder if you could come up and give us just, in that we heard from planning and enforcement staff in the Community Development Department, the Legal Department, from the Police Department's perspective, there are some general concerns that I think you'd like us to be aware of. Could you just give us a thumbnail of things that you want us to be taking into consideration while we talk about these various specific terms and provisions?
Yes, Councilmember Falcone and members of council, and I apologize for being here late and not being able to give you my comments in the context of the discussion that's taken place here and also with the public comment. In general, and I will preface it by saying the police department is supportive and also will work with other city staff in not only this ordinance, but any other additional ordinances or controls that we might need to at least have an orderly, come up with a community-wide orderly method of operating these dispensaries, and also in the agreement of the neighborhoods that they come into. And obviously some of this came to us because of conflict in the neighborhoods of how these are operated and their impact on the qualities of life. I don't have any more answers than other people do in terms of us getting the discussion started here. I will say that in the context of what was a law passed in California for very good reasons, in my opinion, it has, in the method that we had to implement this law statewide, it has put communities like ours and others in a difficult situation to try and navigate in this new area, and in a unique position, I think, in terms of how we normally let drugs out for therapeutic reasons. And so we're all trying to come to grips with methodologies and strategies to find a win-win in this, and certainly in the spirit of the law that it was passed, and the police department feels that way as well. That being said, as we're all trying to find this appropriate middle ground, there have been impacts on the neighborhood, both from just traffic and minor nuisance issues that they report, along with some reported crimes in the areas of some of the dispensaries. So to the degree that those types of topics can enter into the discussions on how we best permit and operate these things so that we can do it safely and get marijuana out to those people that the intent of the law was designed for, we would certainly want to be a participant in that from our perspective.
Thank you, Chief. All right, Mr. House.
Well, I wanted to sort of echo a little bit of what Mr. Wiley was saying, in that this conversation that we're having here is us getting around the table and starting to talk about it. So, and I know the way that you handled it, Madam Chair, was pretty great, because the next time we meet about this, the public comment period will once again be open. We'll be able to hear back. I don't see any reason why people can't submit letters or emails to us as well, and really keep the dialogue going, because we really want this to be a workable solution, and I think that's a critical component of it. It's not intended to be onerous, but actually make the community safer and meet the needs of both the clients of the dispensaries and the neighbors and the community at large. I think some of the things that I've highlighted in my notes as I was going through here have already been spoken to. I've got some little typo-y type things here I'll share with staff later. Okay, on the 1,000 square feet, I did note, as I read, that I was concerned that that could be too small, especially once I began to read the other requirements for what happens inside those 1,000 square feet, and it seemed like that, I couldn't, it was hard to imagine how all that would fit in there. On page 8, that D2, which has already been mentioned, the business about getting prior approval to enlarge the dispensary, I can understand that, but the issue of the number of patients, it could easily be misread if as somebody mentioned earlier. Perhaps that could be left out. I guess the D3 part raises the larger question for me, and that is that there's something so entirely unique about having an establishment which dispenses medical prescription drugs or whatever. I mean, there's obviously in thrifty drugstore or Long's, there's a section called the pharmacy in the back or wherever it is, and those drugs are kept in a secure and safe area separate from the public access, but they don't have the front door locked. You know, I mean, it's not, I don't see what the benefit of that is, and that would be something I'd like to hear more about if for some reason there's a benefit to the public for having it like that. I think that would make it pretty awkward for somebody coming to pick up their prescription if they were having to wait out on the sidewalk until somebody were to let them in, and you could have a line waiting out there and one at a time or something. That whole thing seems awkward to me. On page, let's see, 9, I had also noted a concern about the monthly requirement or the discouragement of having daily or weekly visits. I can see some real unintended consequences of that, some of which have been mentioned, and also perhaps even a safety issue for somebody who comes and picks up a month's supply of cannabis. That might make them a target as they're walking back to their car, or somebody coming with more money than they would normally carry with them. So those are possibly unintended consequences. There's at the bottom of that same section on page 9, F4, it says a dispensary shall not have a physician on site to evaluate patients and provide a recommendation or prescription for the use of medical cannabis. And I have a sense of why that's there, but I'd like somebody to just explain it out loud. What do you think the intent of that is, or the purpose of that?
Mr. Wiley, I have an idea as well.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm just assuming that would be designed to prevent a medical marijuana dispensary mill. You know, oh, well, you don't have a doctor's note, you don't have a county ID card, just, it'll take a few minutes. But,
just show up.
And there's an extra charge here to go see the doctor. We don't have to have it in there, but I think the intent here is to prevent that sort of thing, a drop-in visit with a doctor to get the note.
Right, and just because we've had this conversation a number of years ago, the city vehicle is not the vehicle that dispenses the card, that validates the doctor's note, that has a department that regulates this sort of activity. The legislature specifically put that charge, that activity of validating a doctor's note and issuing a permit card at the county level. It's all at the county level. They have the health department. They have the mental health department. They have the social welfare department. We do not. So that's why cities do not engage in that particular piece of it. So it wouldn't be appropriate, really. I mean, it's one thing to have the obstetrician next door to the eyeglass factory, but it's another thing to have a doctor on site for anybody who walks in to just sort of do that. I think the legislature did want to keep some controls on the legitimacy of the use. So that would be my 2 cents at a guess as to why other cities have that provision.
Perhaps for next time, what I would like to know is if there's a track record of problems. It sounds like there may be, But if it could also have been that somebody was fearful or concerned, wanting to be proactive. But if there actually has been elsewhere problems associated with having a physician on site, and nothing intended to at all to intrude on the state's provisions and the county's responsibility. But I would just like to know more about that, whether there actually are problems associated with that proximity. On page 11, I3, minimum staffing levels. Again, it's just curious. Dispensary premises shall be staffed with at least one person during all hours of operation who shall not be responsible for dispensing medical cannabis. And so what's that about? Why wouldn't there perhaps a very small place have one employee there and that they would be able to dispense the cannabis with a prescription? What is the call for having another person who can't do that?
Madam Chair, I have an idea about that. I don't actually know, but I think it has to do with security. And I think the locked door has to do with security as well. You know, we've had instances, even here in Santa Barbara, where these places have been, like, people gone in with guns and ripped off, you know, taking the marijuana. So I think some of these ideas that maybe that means a security guard or someone who's, you know, if I'm working with, let's say I'm the dispenser person and I'm working with a patient, I'm in a separate room, you know, who's going to walk in the door and, you know, pull out their guns? Maybe it's that sort of thing. That's what I thought when I read it too.
So I guess maybe the fact that these are sort of speculative and that we're trying to wrestle down to why they used these in the past. I'd like to know more about that and what the validity of the justifying that. It might be very, very valid and extremely important to do that. I don't understand the rationale well enough, and I don't know if I buy well, maybe I do. I would like to hear more about that. Page 12, I4, so I'd be at the top of the page. Just a little note there. It's our sign ordinance is pretty clear. Are we being more restrictive? And I'm looking to see. I mean, our signs are supposed to be for identification purposes of the business. Our signs by ordinance are not supposed to be, although they seem to all over the place, they're not supposed to be talking about the contents of what we're selling in there. It would be the name of the shop. So this talks about the not exceeding 6 square feet in an area of 10% or an area of 10% of the window area. I mean, so does it comply with the sign ordinance or not? Is sort of more where I'm going with it. And then I had a note on page 17. Let's see what that is here. The appeal to the Planning Commission. Is the Planning Commission's decision final, or is it then appealable to the City Council? It doesn't say that in here. I would like to know how that would work.
The Planning Commission decision would be final. It's proposed to be final. It does say may not be appealed to the City Council.
Pardon me?
The draft does say that the Planning Commission's decision may not be appealed to the City Council. Now, if the Ordinance Committee and the Council wants to have these appeals, we certainly can change that.
I'm not exactly looking for them there, Steve.
No,
I just wondered. I wanted to be sure it was clear one way or another.
I have to tell you, unlike a lot of older city ordinances, the current thinking is we don't have to legally, constitutionally make everything appealable to the City Council. It's a policy question, and so we're inclined to not draft the dance permit, for example, ordinances. Only got a limited number of areas where appeals can be made to the City Council.
Towing group, you know,
right.
at the P.
Right. I recall a
Commission.
2-week City Council hearing over revoking someone's tow permit because the towing permit is appealable to the
Well, we already have things at Planning Commission, which that's the end of the line in the coastal zone and things like that. So I do understand that. I just wanted to make sure it was clear. And then just the general approach thing I wanted to address for a moment. The way that we view pharmacies, and I think Mr. Barnwell mentioned this, but the way that we view pharmacies, to me, there's some. It would be nice if this got to the point where it's so innocuous, it's just not a big deal, and it was pharmacy-like in its character. So if we could accomplish that somehow, I don't know if we're going to be able to. We seem like we're all very much protecting, and because of the concerns and the issues that have already happened with some of them, not well managed perhaps, But pharmacies are well managed, and they have to be, and they have to abide by very, very strict regulations. That we don't enforce them ourselves here in the city, but they have to, and otherwise they would lose their license. And we would. And there's access. There's a lot of stuff in there that if anybody in the public were to go and rob them at gunpoint and could get very sick or ill or die. So I tend to think that there's some model in there. The CUP approach to me is a little bit more appealing, going along the same lines. Now. At least this is just my initial take, and it may not hold. We'll see. But the idea that we could begin with, say, a limited CUP, where it would have a limited amount of time, come back for review after a year or two or some staging. But at some point, if it's just no problem, why have them come back over and over and over again, for re-upping? Remember, you can revoke a conditional use permit based on a complaint on any given day. I mean, basically, you can bring them back in if they've broken the rules. So I would like to, hear more reasons why that's not a good idea, because it seems like it is a good idea to me. I think that's it for my comments at this. Oh, the second. Somebody else mentioned scheduling. I think Mr. Barnwell did. The holidays. It's just some of these things that are like odd and not just the way we run a normal everyday business. It just adds extra character to the conversation that I don't think helps us anywhere. Our goal is to get this to be a not a big deal kind of situation, and I don't see how that's helping us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. House. Here are my comments. Let me address one of the, we received an email from someone who wasn't able to be here, an Ethan Kravitz, and he brought up a number of items I'd like to address. The first one starts with the purpose and intent paragraph that is 28.80.020. And the language in there, and I realize that we have lifted a lot of this stuff from various other jurisdictions that have grappled with this in their own ways. That wording says to regulate locations of medical cannabis dispensary in order to promote health, safety, morals, and general welfare of residents, businesses within the city. His comment is he'd like to see the word moral stricken, and I tend to agree. I'm not quite sure what that word's doing there. We not regulate morals. So at any rate, that I agree with. As far as the storefront locations, I agree with Mr. Cato. As far as the reasons why this might exist with respect to the locking of the doors, it does sort of remind me. It brings to mind a picture of the old speakeasies. Where you open the little door and who's there. And I don't think we need to go that far, but there is certainly something to say about the robbery potential of the merchandise, like a jewelry store. It's very attractive, and it brings a lot on the alternative market. So we have to be cognizant of that. It's for the operator's safety just as much as for the patron's safety. So I'd like that to be addressed in some way without conjuring up the old sort of, chain on the door speakeasy kind of image. The criminal history of the folks who are operating, I cannot, in good conscience, say that we are going to overlook criminal histories of folks. I understand that all crimes are not created equal, and that there certainly is a broad spectrum of what folks get in trouble for. And the little itty-bitty misdemeanor, I think that there's some movement there. But I would like Mr. Wiley, since it's been a very long time, to define crimes of moral turpitude. They are misdemeanors, but they are a vastly different type of misdemeanor. So it takes a certain threshold to get there. These are usually sex crimes of some form or another. Mr. Wiley, could you give the public a little better understanding of why that rises to a different level than just your itty-bitty sort of misdemeanor ticket?
Well, the only area where I'm sure that is a crime of moral turpitude is the theft, I'm sorry, not theft, perjury and embezzlement. I don't even know that sex crimes are considered crimes
they're
of
probably
moral
felonies,
turpitude. Because they're felonies, yeah. But we don't have to have it in there.
All right, well, maybe a little more explanation on that, because...
I don't think it is. It's a very vague term, and the courts say we know it when we see it.
Kind of like pornography.
It's very commonly, perjury is flat out, lawyers can lose their state bar ticket for a misdemeanor, a crime of moral turpitude. Perjury is clearly one. Embezzlement from a client is a crime of moral turpitude, even a misdemeanor. And that's about all I can really tell you definitely.
Okay. All right. The next one in this particular grouping is hours of operations. I think that the Planning Commission can sort that out. I don't think staying open past a certain hour in the evening is healthy for the community, but I don't know what that time necessarily is. There are a couple of other ones here that I'm going to go over in my actual comments, but the issue of alcoholic beverages on premises, I agree that there shouldn't be any alcoholic beverages in a marijuana dispensary, except that this gentleman brings up a particular type of cannabis, alcohol-based cannabis tinctures. Okay. I'm not quite sure if that's widely used or what the deal there is, but we need to reconcile that internal conflict of no alcoholic beverages, nobody with booze in or out or on premises, but there evidently is this type. So if we could reconcile that somehow, I'm not going to go into it any further. The 3-year limit, I think, is an extremely good idea for the time being. Now, the special use permit, I'm leaning toward the conditional use permit, and if everything in a number of years, be it, 6 or 10 or whatever it is going great, or after the first couple of the 3-year limit, and then of course there's a re-upping of the 3 years. If everything is going fabulously, then I can understand why we wouldn't want people to have to go through that. However, a CUP, a straight-up CUP, running with the land, is something that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because that is a forever deal, and we can cancel it, but that's a big deal. It has to hit a lot of thresholds, and some right that runs with the land is a big deal. So I'm a little leery of it. I will leave it to the Planning Commission to sort that out a little bit more. We did have to go back to the dance ordinance after a number of years because there was no limit on the dance ordinance. And we found that a revisiting of the license, if you will, the permit, was a necessary component. I don't think this is going to be a lot different. I think we're going to want to review periodically. That's my thought. I'm also leaning to being fine with the restrictions with respect to not in residential and not within X distance from residential. I think that's where we got into trouble to begin with. Commercial areas, and as Mr. Barnwell correctly pointed out, every commercial area in the city has residential available, but it's not residentially zoned. That's the difference. So in commercial areas, the ones that were mentioned, I have no problem with that. I'm a little leery about the M1, though. I didn't hear anybody else bring it up. But knowing some of the activities that go down, that take place in the M1, I'm wondering whether or not it's advisable to put more monitoring situations in the M1. I'll leave that for the police department to discuss and think about, because they're the ones who have to enforce the places that go wrong. The places that are right are welcomed and necessary, and that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to the patients, as was said by both of my colleagues, and the majority, if not unanimously, by City Council when we discussed the conceptual idea of this, is that access for patients on a legitimate use is fundamentally okay and necessary with all of us. That's not what this is about. It's always, 5% of the people create 95% of the problem or something along like that. It's for those folks who it goes wrong, and it does go wrong, we know that. So that's what we're trying to get to, I think, with all this, specificity with regard to the terms and conditions. ADA access, fundamental. We got to get to that. You got to figure it out. How do you accommodate ADA? Mr. Wiley.
The law requires that, so we don't draft it into everything we write.
Okay, well.
It's like saying you have to comply with Uniform Building Code. Yes, you
Okay.
have to comply
All
with
right.
the Uniform Building Code.
So it will be done. The monthly purchase amount. Isn't there a legislative limit on the amount that you can hold for these purposes? It's 1/8 of an ounce or something, if my memory serves correctly?
Actually, I believe it's more like 8 ounces. I'm sorry, you're right. Half,
8 ounces.
8 ounces is not right.
Is
No.
it 8 ounces?
8
Oh,
ounces.
okay.
yeah. 8 ounces
and
and a certain number of dead plants and a certain number of live plants.
Yeah, there are those sort of qualifications. So maybe we can look at that as a limiting factor somewhere along the line. I'm not sure how quickly people go through that amount. I guess it's individual, but I think monthly may not accommodate folks well enough. I don't know. Okay, the existing dispensaries. As far as I remember, the moratorium was not to affect those businesses currently in business and doing fine. Their operations were all that we hoped they to be. But it was, I think, our intent, I won't speak for the whole council, I'm just working from memory, that all of the dispensaries, no matter when they were opened, will comply with whatever it is the ordinance, whatever ordinance we pass. So people will have to come in and hit that mark, but they won't have to stop doing business during the moratorium period. That's what I understand. And we certainly don't want to put anyone out of business with our geographical limitations. So we have to devise, if we say that Milpas is not going to work because of the limits with respect to residential, and there are several, I'd like a map of the ones actually that are still going. I know a number have closed down, but there are a number still going, and they have legal counsel. I'd like a map, but that's collateral to this conversation. I don't want to put anybody out of business with these restrictions if they're doing well and they are going to comply with the ordinance provisions. So we have to get to that. The federal raids that have put some people out of business, or whatever the feds threatened to do, this ordinance isn't going to stop that activity by the federal government, is it? No. No. So we can, there are lots of activities I'd like to stop with the federal government, but that being said, we can put all the ordinances and restrictions and limitations and licenses in place that we like, but that's not going to protect someone from whatever action it was that the feds threatened 2 months ago, or 3 months ago, whenever it was, correct? Okay, Deputy Chief Glass.
I'd just like to add, Councilmember Falcone, that even the elements of the operation of these under state law have come under the scrutiny of the district attorney's office, and there are certain elements that in their position, some of the operating practices are not in compliance with state law as well. And so there are arguments, they're argumentative at this point. I don't think there's been legal action at the county, but at both the federal and local level, that is of concern.
Thank you very much. We also, this is at the state level, we have a new Attorney General who may or may not decide to pursue this at all. So the last thing I have is, would you please clarify the language in L on page 12? And that has to do with keeping records, which has been mentioned by both of my colleagues. The language here is, the dispensary shall maintain records of all patients. I assume that's just their name, possibly their address. I don't know why you need their address. Well, I guess I do. Primary caregiver, that seems okay. We should know who's issuing this stuff, these cards. And the identification card number that is issued by the county. I'm not sure we need more than that. I'm not sure that this language asks for more than that. But some sort of just general who's coming in and who gave him the prescription, I don't think that's invasive. If you want to analogize these to pharmacies, which you can't because pharmacies are regulated by the feds and they don't recognize compassionate use marijuana. But if you're using that analogy, pharmacies certainly keep records of a whole heck of a lot more than that. But somebody tell me if I'm simplifying it too much.
Well, I think my view of this requirement that the dispensary maintain records using only either the county ID number, if a county card has been issued, or if the patient hasn't obtained a county ID card, a copy of the physician's note prescribing, or actually it's not a prescription, but recommending the use of medical marijuana. I don't think that's a very burdensome requirement, and it's not going to be very personally invasive because it's only by the number or the note. And I would assume that a dispensary would want to have that just to protect itself in the event the state or I guess it'd be the state, inquires if they're complying with state law. Now, I can see that this last sentence, such records may be maintained on or off-site and shall be made available for inspection by any city officer. I think that's in there because some cities were more inclined to get into enforcing the issues of the state law requirements. For example, that these dispensaries not operate on a for-profit basis. And that, or even just more fundamentally, that they're only giving or selling marijuana to, actually it wouldn't be a sale, exchanging marijuana to someone who has the proper ID card or doctor's note. I'm not so sure that that's the approach that we're inclined to take, that we're really actually interested in demanding these records in order to verify that. I think our approach will be more to defer to the state authorities on that. So at this point, I think I would be inclined to take that second sentence out.
Yeah, I think I'm leaning that way too. I think the bare sort of information is sufficient for the purposes of protecting all of the, legitimate parties involved. I know the city of Oakland has one of these ordinances, and that's a wholly different kettle of fish than the city of Santa Barbara. The city attorney there happens to be a dear personal friend, and his comment was that it was a torturous process. I'm hoping to avoid that whole thing. But certainly what some cities need in order to keep everyone safe is hopefully not what we need to go that far. So, all right, well, those are my comments. I wish the Planning Commission luck. Any further comments from my colleagues? Mr. House, and Mr. Cato is waving his hand. Wow. Mr. Cato.
Chair Buckley, if I could get a few clarifications. First of all, I believe you said that you wanted a X distance from residential zones, but you were okay with them in commercial zones, and you didn't care whether there was residents next door?
No, I'm agreeing with your no residential zones and X distance from
existing residences.
residences. Well, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it with what you're recommending for the moment, but I would ask the Planning Commission to really dig their teeth into that particular condition and see what it really means to folks, because I don't think that today, looking at the lovely map, that we can really discern exactly how that's going to affect where these operations can go. Mr. House.
With regards to the same exact topic, the principle that I'm operating on in reviewing this is that I want the experience to be safe for the clients. And I could very well see that it would be safer for a client to be able to go into a storefront on Milpa Street, which may very well, half a block away, have residences, and brightly lit, normal, I mean, daytime activity, and rather than, say, some hidden away off hidden corner of some dark place, or so I'm interested in seeing that principle fulfilled, and I want to share that with the others here. I don't know if we all agree, but I want to share that. And I don't know which of those really fulfill it. I had a couple more comments very briefly before we're done.
I think not off in the dark somewhere is what I was really addressing kind of on an emotional level with the M1 when I brought up my concerns about M1. Mr. Barnwell.
I share the concerns about M1. And I'm not in favor of the M1. I'm actually going to take a stand on it and say I'm not in favor of the M1. But I do lean in the direction of the C2 and the CM. And those zoning uses, those zoning designations recognize a variety of uses, including the adult bookstore. And so unless we get just so specific that we become hidebound and can't move, I think we're going in the right direction with the C2, and we can't get too tricky with the residential because, we got residential all over the place. I think the school part is very, very important, though. And then to go back to the concern represented by all of us here to one degree or another is the locked door, and then the concern that it's a potential for robbery, et cetera. That actually exists everywhere. Every business has the problem of somebody might pull a gun. But maybe what we're talking about is keeping the marijuana behind the counter or not easily accessible. You can't just walk up to it and grab the containers, et cetera, somewhat again like the model we'd have in a pharmacy or even a bank, where you go in to get the money at the bank. Even though it's your money, they don't let you just go behind the counter and fondle everybody's money and just pick whatever you want. It's kind of regulated how it comes across the counter. Right. So if we're heading in that direction, I think it happens interior in the operation, somewhat at a counter. And somehow, that's what we're talking about, not a locked door on the outside. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Cotto, and then Mr. House has a few more items. And remember, this we will all, and I mean all of us, get a number of other opportunities to weigh in on these issues. So if some of our conversation has brought up other questions and so forth, there is ample opportunity to weigh in. Mr. Cotto.
I believe I heard all three of you say that you you wanted some sort of special use permit or conditional use permit. I didn't hear which board you thought would be appropriate, staff hearing officer or planning commission? Staff hearing officer?
I'm a staff hearing officer.
Okay. I think I'll listen to the planning commission recommendation on that.
Okay. And then an idea I had about the renewals, perhaps the first couple of renewals would be at the staff hearing officer, and then if everything went okay, then everything subsequent to that would be at the staff level, or we could play with things like that.
Great. Mr. House. Okay,
just a couple things then. First of all, on page 12 and that L, I really do like that there's an or in the middle of it because, as we know, this ID card or whatever it is, this card hasn't been fully worked out yet, and there could be qualifying patients or users that don't have that. So this shows that we have that worked out. We definitely want to know more about. I want to know more about the existing dispensaries and how we're going to handle that. I also would like us to, with regards to, let's say there weren't in a given moment when they were permitted residences nearby a dispensary, and then later residences came in. I don't necessarily think that means that the dispensary has to go.
Yeah.
I think there should be some provision. If it's not a problem, why raise an issue? That's the way I would like us to discuss, look at it. And then I know we had concerns from the community about the odor of marijuana, which can be pretty pungent coming out of a dispensary. And I understand that in here it says using a vaporizer or something, a hookah or whatever that is. So I would be
A bong, I
bong,
think. No, I
right?
don't
Yeah,
know.
okay, there you go. Yeah, but the issue, of course, is that can become a nuisance for the surrounding community, and we want to make sure we take care of that. And that was it. Thank you.
That brings up one issue that none of us addressed, and that is the issue of sampling the product on premises. We didn't bring it up, but I'd like for everyone to think about, I mean, I know you can go into the cigar store on Figueroa Street and sit down and just hang out with your buddies and do that. I'm not 100% sure that's, I mean, I'm not sure we want to create a social club. It's a dispensary, and so I don't know what to do with that issue quite, but it's an issue for me, and I think it's an issue for others. And so I'd like it to be discussed.
Okay.
Mr. Barnwell.
Well, you do prohibit the consumption of the cannabis on site, correct?
It's somewhere in there, yes.
Yeah, it's on page 10, item G1. Shall not be consumed by patients on the premises of the dispensary or within X number of feet around it, which I hope would get rid of Mr. House's concern also of the smell. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that. Correct, Mr. Cato? Is that the way you...
Yes, but there is something about a vaporizer in there that I read, and it's a little bit...
it's a little
I share
we'll figure
Ms.
that out.
Falcone's concern in that regard.
We will deal with that, yes.
All right. Mr. Cato, anything further? Chief? Mr. Wiley? Colleagues? For now, we're adjourned. Thank